My dear beloved people of God, we are on the 31st Ordinary Sunday. Are you led by good leaders in your life? Are you following the guidance of true religious leaders? The readings of this Sunday give you a caution not to follow any kind of leader, even your religious leaders. So how are we to recognize good leaders in order to follow them, and to recognize the false leaders in order to avoid them? The scripture readings themselves make clear to us. The first reading from the book of Malachi explicitly speaks about the judgment of God on the priests of Malachi's time. The reason for the curse mentioned on the priests and on their blessing is their attitude toward God and His service. The primary role of the priest, as Malachi thought, was to guard, to conserve, or to keep the knowledge of God true and pure from one generation to the next. They were the guardians and instructors of the religious knowledge. But the priests of Malachi's day did not walk with God. They had turned aside from the way of Yahweh and had caused many to stumble by their false instructions. They were supposed to glorify God, but instead they glorified themselves. A similar thing we see in today's gospel passage. Jesus addresses the crowds and His disciples regarding the religious leaders of His day, the Scribes and the Pharisees. Jesus says, since the Scribes and the Pharisees occupy the seat of authority to teach, they are to be respected. He asks them to do whatever they teach and follow it, but cautions them not to do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. The second part of what I said just now can be well understood, but the first part is a bit confusing. Why? Because in the previous teachings of Jesus regarding the Pharisees, He had proved Scribes and the Pharisees as not interpreting the law of Moses correctly. That the Pharisees and the Scribes do not interpret the law of Moses according to the mind of God. And in this chapter, later on, He calls them blind guides who misguide the people. So what does Jesus really mean? The disciples and the crowds are to do or keep what the religious leaders say only in the sense of obeying what they read from the scriptures. For they read the scriptures very accurately, but not in terms of their interpretation. For they do not interpret the scriptures correctly. The Pharisees and the Scribes were hypocrites who did not do in public the will of God as revealed by the scriptures. The hypocrisy is not only the contradiction between the deed and the word, but also in the contradiction in the deed and the motive. Whatever they did was not with a proper motive. They were religious leaders not for God but for themselves. They were supposed to glorify God, but they glorified themselves. Jesus offers 5 examples of their misguided efforts to impress others. First, they make their phylacteries broader and their fringes long. The phylacteries were tiny small boxes containing the scripture verse in order to remind them to be faithful to the law of Moses. They were worn either on the arm or on the forehead. They are mentioned in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Deuteronomy. While they might express genuine faithfulness or piety, here broader boxes are interpreted as drawing attention to the wearer's piety. The fringes were tassels worn on the edge of the outer garment. They too were misused to gain attention. Second, they loved the best places at the banquets. The best place at the banquet was besides the host. They always wished to have that place. Third, similar behavior was seen at the prayer time in the synagogues. They loved to have the best seats in the synagogue. Fourth, it is also evident in the marketplaces. They loved to be greeted in the marketplaces with much respect. Greeting recognizes one's importance. And fifth, to have people call them Rabbi, the general term of honor, also meant a teacher or an authoritative leader. In all this, the religious leaders sought glory not for God but for themselves. It was for self-glorification. So whatever they did was not with a proper motive. Motive was something else. Was only to gain attention toward themselves, to gain self-importance, and to receive honor and glory. But Jesus says to His disciples that His disciples' community should not work for self-glory. St. Paul in today's second reading gives his own example, how humble he was. Even as a great preacher in the missions, he set an example for others by working humbly without seeking self-glory. He worked selflessly. My dear God's people, once ordained a priest, it does not mean that he becomes a superhuman being, knowing everything. Priests can make mistakes sometimes. Some misguide their people. I too have seen this. What are we to do? We are to be cautious. We are not to follow them. Neither are we to condemn them, but to go and speak to them and help them out. May God bless all of you.